Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Those of you who are veterans of these lectures will know that they don't purport to be cutting-edge scholarship or theologically innovative, but are rather ways of relating the more bookish work that we do in the university and in the Muslim college to the wider world and wider denominational communities. Hence the, I hope forgivably, cheeky title of my lecture this evening. I'm going to start with Alan Bennett, since the 1960s, famous screenwriter mainly, who's kept his thumb unerringly close to the national pulse. He began, of course, Beyond the Fringe with Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, and then moved through Talking Heads and The Madness of King George to his very recent hit, The Habit of Art, which played last year to packed houses at the National Theatre. A North Country man who once thought he would be a vicar, formed in the now more or less unimaginable England of the 40s and 50s, his humour and decidedly humane scrutiny of the national character makes him perhaps the nearest thing that this country has to Matt Groening, creator of The Simpsons. He remembers the Christian values of close-knit Yorkshire towns of the 1930s, but unerringly observes the comedy of the New Britain, of the iPod, the iPad, and the metrosexual generation. Bennett recently emerged from a bout of writer's block to deliver up a short story. His head had been full of ideas, apparently, but they were too bleak to visit on the public. The story that finally appeared, The Laying On of Hands, is, he says, as dark as I could let myself be publicly without being rejected altogether. At first blush, it's not clear what he means. The story is written with a light touch and is in places riotously funny, but it does have a sharp edge. The chief character is a young and moderately high church vicar, and the action takes place entirely in his church as he conducts a memorial service for Clive, a masseur and rent boy whose services he had himself enjoyed. The congregation, made up largely of the cool Britannia elite, includes many of the discreet masseur's other clients. Chat show hosts and academics are disproportionately represented, of course, but there is also a bishop, a senior treasury official, and an architect. Some are men, but there are grieving women also, since Clive, like Bennett himself, had been of ambiguous preferences. Nothing in our postmodern world that resents fixed essences of any kind is so passé nowadays as the idea of a gay identity. The liturgy, of course, cannot presume any religious commitment on the part of the bereaved. Readings and prayers are suitably generic, and the life hereafter goes unmentioned. Yet the spirit of judgment is in the air. This takes most immediate form in the shape of a diocesan inspector, Archdeacon Treacher, who sits at the back to make notes on the incumbent's performance. Of course, is interested only in his liturgical delivery. In the naughty 90s, it's not the vicar's homosexuality which is the object of judgment. As Treacher reflects, once upon a time, homosexuals had made excellent priests and still could, so long as they were sensible. The homosexuals Treacher preferred were dry, acerbic, and of course unavowed. A.E. Houseman, the type that he approved of, minus the poetry, of course, and, though this was less important, minus the atheism. The other judgment that hangs in the air is that of HIV/AIDS. The congregation, free of any concern for their friends' fate in an afterlife, are pondering their own mortality. Towards the end of an embarrassing and very un-English addition to the liturgy, when the congregants stand up and reminisce about their own memories of the deceased, it becomes clear that Clive had been killed not by the modern plague, but by a poisonous caterpillar while holidaying in Peru. As this revelation dawns on the congregation, the church seems filled with light and the burden is lifted, and the priest too feels obscurely that he had been saved. The dismayed diocesan inspector, formed in a very different age, slips out. He is not entirely to be deplored, says Bennett, standing in this tale for dignity, formality, and self-restraint. Less feeling was what Treacher wanted, the services of the church as he saw it a refuge from the prevailing sloppiness. As opportunities multiplied for the display of sentiment in public and on television, confessing, grieving, and giving way to anger, and always with a ready access to tears, So it seemed to Treacher that there was needed a place for dryness and self-control, and this was the church. It was not a popular view, and he sometimes felt that he had much in common with a Jesuit priest on the run in Elizabethan England, clandestine, subversive, and holding to the old faith, even though the tenets of that faith, discretion, understatement, and respect for tradition, might seem more suited to tailoring than they did to religion. Once out of the churchyard, the archdeacon lit up, his smoking further evidence that there was more to this man than had been told in this tale. There had briefly been a Mrs. Treacher, a nice woman, but she had died. He would die soon too, and the bishop at least would be relieved. Of course, Bennett is seeking neither to edify us nor to warn us with this little yarn. He merely invites us to reflect on the ironies implicit in a national life where a national church, whose superb buildings and ceremonies offer an image of dignity and restraint to an age in which those principles are strange, still tries to accommodate the diversity of godless Britain. The price, however, is its commitment to kerygma. Preaching, conversion, truth itself can hardly be appropriate features of such settings. The tarnished throng in Bennett's church might, he says, be taken as a version of England. And a whole battalion of sociologists are likely to agree. The church today can resemble an eggshell, a membrane of propriety and dignified forms behind which throbs the secular drumbeat of the modern Mardi Gras, the aspirational yuppie culture cultivated by Thatcher, the feel-good spin of a Labour without socialism, the national lottery, pole dancing clubs, Facebook and MySpace. British Muslim communities have been studied in many ways, but the perhaps obvious backdrop of the decline of the nation's religious life has not been sufficiently noted. Perhaps this is symptomatic of the training of many researchers in the older paradigms of the study of that vague thing, race relations. It was understood that the default normalcy in Britain, a kind of generic whiteness, was permanent. Shift the focus from race to religion, however, and it's not clear that there is an unchanging British default. Understanding the journey that British Muslims have made from the 1950s and earlier to the current new decade cannot properly be attempted unless we recall that British religiosity and the value system it used to support have changed almost beyond recognition. At the beginning of this period, Muslims found themselves in a largely church-going society ruled by Mrs. Miniver, where queers were in the closet and nice girls said no. Now, in the words of the Anglican essayist Michael Hampson, Christianity today occupies the same space on the fringes of mainstream culture as any other major or minor religious cult or claim from any continent. Spiritualism, astrology, reincarnation, perhaps more respectable than Wicca or clairvoyance, but less respectable than Reiki or domestic Feng Shui. The statistics need only brief citation. In a 2004 poll, only 44% of British citizens responded affirmatively to the question, "Do you believe in God?" A 2007 Tear Fund survey found that 53% of adults in the UK identify themselves as Christians and only 7% as practicing Christians. 2/3 had not gone to church in the previous year. The same survey determined that 66% of British subjects, that is to say 32.2 million people, had no contact with the church or with any other religion. Half of these were once religious but are now lapsed. The other half, 16.2 million, have never experienced membership of any religion. A British social attitudes survey suggests that the percentage of those who say they belong to Christianity has fallen from 66% in 1983 to only 48% in 2006. The decline of the national church has been even more precipitous, so that in 2007 a survey by Christian Research indicated that for the first time since the Reformation, more people in this country attend Catholic than Anglican services. The average weekly attendance at the Roman Mass is 861,000 people, compared with 852,000 who appear at Church of England services on an average Sunday. The decline in Anglican worshippers reached a vertiginous 20% between 2000 and 2006. The decline in Catholic attendance was somewhat less, at 13%, thanks in part to immigration from Catholic countries such as Poland. Religious literacy also seems to be widespread. A 2003 Maury poll found that only 55% of the population can now name one of the four Gospels, while slightly more, 60%, could name the sacred book of Islam. Now, pondering this data, a minor war seems to be underway between sociologists of religion. An older school maintains that Britain has seen a steady decline in religiosity since the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment. What we're now seeing, they say, is simply the end game of a very long, slow process. So Steve Bruce, in his book God is Dead, is one example of this view. Other, somewhat more recent scholars, however, have suggested that the evidence simply does not support this image of a slow and steady decline. Callum Brown, for instance, claims that as late as the mid-20th century, Christianity was in a modest way thriving, and that its current weakness is the result of a very recent precipitous decline. Compare the figures, for instance, for religiously solemnized marriages. In 1962, 70% of the population was married in a religious ceremony, a figure commensurate, more or less, with 19th century norms. Only 8 years later, it had fallen to 60%, slumping to 39% in 1997. And the figures for Anglican baptism tell a similar story. In 1900, for every 1,000 live births, 609 baptisms took place. In 1927, the number had actually risen to 668, dropping back to 602 in 1956. And then, when the figure had been more or less constant for the first 50 years of the century, the same slump can be observed, down to 466 in 1970, 365 in 1981, and 228 in 1997. The debaptism movement now is a particularly striking sign of this. According to the National Secular Society, by the year 2009, 100,000 people had felt strongly enough to fork out £3 to download forms and officially register their rejection of their baptism. Church membership, too, indicates that the older model of a gently secularizing Britain needs to be replaced by a model of pretty robust religiosity which endured well into the 1960s, followed by a sudden decline. Church membership rose in the 19th century, reaching a peak in England and Wales in 1904 and 1905 in Scotland. The figures slowly decline until the Second World War, when they pick up again, rising to a second climax in 1959. And then the sudden decline begins, and it is continuing apace. On current trends, the Church of Scotland calculates that by the year 2030 it will have ceased to exist. Now, in the context of my subject tonight, we don't need to spend much time considering the various explanations of this trend, or the odd, and to many analysts still confounding, contrast with the continuing buoyancy of churchmanship in, say, the United States. But it does help to remember that integration today, whatever it means, must signify something radically different from what it was thought to signify or require in the Britain which Muslim migrants reached before, say, the Wolfenden Report or the Chatterley trial or the Beatles' first LP. Integration signifies not the deepening engagement of an essential Muslimness with an essentially static Britishness. It looks more like an eternally renegotiated process whereby religious minorities, like adherents of the majority religion, are expected permanently to keep up with values of markedly utilitarian and secular provenance, values which are themselves subject to endless amendment and change. In other words, the current government or academic agenda on integration, social cohesion and its study is always highly provisional. Perhaps Muslims and other believers should be encouraged by this. After all, a Britain that required accession to values that were conceived as absolute would be theologically far harder for Muslims and others who believe that theirs are the true absolutes to engage with. So, having begun by sketching the rather odd situation of Muslim believers here, who find that the religious culture of the land they migrated to has substantially collapsed, I'm now going to change the subject fairly abruptly and offer some reflections on the nature of the Islam which is being invited to experience integration, as seen from a pre-1960s British perspective. And I'm going to do this by enlisting two perhaps unexpected and certainly underestimated observers, G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc. Chesterton first. As a revanchist English Catholic, he was certain about the old preconciliar formula of extra ecclesia nulla salus, outside the church, no salvation. His view of Islam was very far from the ecumenical and interfaith mood of Vatican II, and he would have frowned in amazement upon the John Paul who kissed the Quran and addressed Muslims as brothers. But like some other brilliant Catholic conservatives, such as Louis Massignon and Louis Gardet, his own life of faith and his deep intelligence allowed him insights into Islam as a religious force that, in an age of that superficial ballo in maschera, a masked ball known as interfaith, are now seldom to be encountered. His view on the clash of Christendom with Islam as a struggle of truth against falsehood is clear enough, evinced, for instance, in his best-known poem, which is nothing other than a celebration of the Battle of Lepanto, the decisive Catholic naval victory against the Ottoman Empire. But his take on Islam turns out to be a perceptive one. Chesterton was a practical kind of person. He was not very interested in abstractions. He was a popular, applied theologian, a realist who enjoyed pointing out dangerous, if farcical, agendas of utopian reformers. And he clearly savoured the writing of his novel The Flying Inn, which was first published in 1914. And in the pages of this novel we discover that following a revival in Ottoman military fortunes, England is now in the grip of profound Islamic influence. Throughout British society, old beliefs and values are giving way to an inexorable tide from the east. On the seafront of coastal resorts like Brighton and Eastbourne, Muslim soapbox preachers are boldly holding forth. And we meet one of these, a little owlish man in a red fez, weakly waving a green gamp umbrella. His face was brown and wrinkled like a walnut, his nose was of the sort we associate with Judea, his beard was the sort of black wedge we associate rather with Persia. And this preacher is explaining how England is in fact only superficially Christian. At root, he says, everything that was thought to be characteristically English turns out to be of Islamic origin. And the evidence he uses is striking. Look, he said, wagging a curled brown finger, look at your own inns, your inns of which you write in your books. These inns were not put up in the beginning to sell the alcoholic Christian drink. They were put up to sell the non-alcoholic Islamic drinks. And the preacher then proceeds to prove this by offering a list of pub names which indicate a distant Islamic etiology, beginning with the Bull, which was apparently once the Bulbul. The Admiral Benbow is in fact the great Muslim warrior Amir Ali Ben Boz. The Saracen's Head is a corruption of the Saracen is a head. Even the word alcohol is of Islamic origin, and so, claims the preacher, we may claim for Islam Allsops beer and even the Albert Memorial. The Islamic influence in London is also plain for all to see. Some deluded souls may point to King's Cross and Charing Cross, but wickedly fail to mention Denmark Crescent, Grosvenor Crescent and Mornington Crescent. Everywhere, I say, homage paid to the holy symbol of the religion of the Prophet. Compare with this network of pattern of crescents, this city almost consisting of crescents, the meagre array of crosses which remain to attest the ephemeral superstition to which you were for one weak moment inclined. In this new Britain, government and the busybodies of Whitehall, inspired by such preaching, and also, more substantively, driven by the need to cooperate with the reinvigorated Turkish Empire, incline to an acceptance of Islam, and thus it is that prohibition comes to England. And the remainder of the novel documents two fugitives who are travelling around the country with Britain's very last barrel of rum, encouraging the habitués of now dry pubs to sing and be merry. The whole thing really is a romp, but I think Chesterton does have some kind of a point to make. He's not predicting our current secularity, he's, I think, warning about alienation. In particular, he's taking aim at early 20th century fad for Eastern religions, adopted by a vapid generation simply on the grounds of their exotic and unconventional surface. More seriously, though, The Flying Inn is a parable about the temperance movement. True religion, for Chesterton, consists in a kind of acceptance of traditional British normalcy, a Tory scepticism about radical projects of any kind, and a repudiation of a Puritanism which is foreign to merry England. Islam for him is where reformed Christianity may finally lead us if wiser heads don't look out. It's not clear whether Chesterton had actual Muslim missionaries in mind. He might have heard of Abdal in Liverpool, many of whose first converts were picked up in temperance halls, and there's certainly a very strong non-conformist feel to many of Quilliam's writings. One imagines that Lord Headley is another possible target. For Chesterton, it would have been unsurprising to learn that British Islam as a contiguous movement emerged not as a radical visitor from elsewhere, a xenotransplant from an exotic place, but as a continuation of the world of congregationalism, pledges and temperance halls. This connection between non-conformity and the Muslim way of doing business with God is dealt with by Chesterton only here in the pages of an essentially frivolous novel. But it's developed much more carefully by his contemporary and fellow Catholic writer Hilaire Belloc, as we learn in chapter 4 of Belloc's very polemical work, The Great Heresies, entitled The Great and Enduring Heresy of Muhammad. Belloc was close to Chesterton, in fact so close that Bernard Shaw used to refer to them collectively as Chester Belloc. Like Chesterton, he knew his history, in which he'd gained a first at Oxford, and regarded Islam as a historic enemy, regretting bitterly the failure of the Crusades to destroy it. That failure, he wrote, is the major tragedy in the history of our struggle against Islam, that is, against Asia. We don't know if he feared an Islamic future emerging from chapel Christianity, but he would surely have sympathised with the moral of the flying in. Still, his account of Islam deserves respect and cannot be dismissed as mere prejudice. Take, for instance, his explanation of the mass conversions of Christians to Islam in the wake of the early Islamic conquests. He has no time for theorists of the bloody scimitar. Instead, he writes that Islam zealously preached and throve on the paramount claims of justice, social and economic. Wherever Islam conquered, there was a new spirit of freedom and relaxation. Not only did it offer a more just social order, it was easy to understand, evincing an extreme simplicity which pleased the unintelligent masses who were perplexed by the mysteries inseparable from the profound intellectual life of Catholicism and from its radical doctrine of the Incarnation. For Belloc, the fact of the success and the persistence of Islam is best explained by its combination of Christian truths such as the virgin birth, the Messiahhood of Christ and the Second Coming, a staunch life of prayer and fasting, and a kind of social gospel which medieval Christianity in its feudal and ecclesial structures was unable to accommodate. And that's why, rather like John of Damascus, he treats Islam not as a new separate religion, but as a Christian heresy. It is not a denial, he writes, but an adaptation and a misuse of the Christian thing. Muhammad preached and insisted upon a whole group of ideas which were peculiar to the Catholic Church. Like Chesterton, Belloc was living in an intense world of converts and Catholic recusants who endlessly felt themselves pinched between a Britishness usually associated with the established church and the universal but foreign church of Rome. The Protestant triumph in his native land was eternally on his brain. Hence, just as Chesterton imputes to nonconformity the capacity to turn Britons into Mussulmans, Belloc ends by defining Islam as a kind of early Reformation. Belloc, in fact, was not the first to categorise Islam in those terms. Carlyle, in his book, a series of lectures, Heroes and Hero Worship, had made this connection largely implicitly some years previously. So had Oswald Spengler. But Belloc makes the link explicit. The most lethal threat to the true Roman Church comes from a direction which may be very generally described as Arian, Islamic and Calvinist. All these heresies denied the ordained priesthood, restricted or abolished the sacraments, and insisted on a programmatic return to a supposed apostolic age before Chalcedonian strictures turned the God worshipped by Jesus into a Greek conundrum. It was heresy in the name of Sancta Simplicitas, holy simplicity. So Belloc writes this: there is thus a very great deal in common between the enthusiasm with which Muhammad's teaching attacked the priesthood, the Mass and the sacraments, and the enthusiasm with which Calvinism, the central motive force of the Reformation, did the same. It insisted upon the equality of men, and it necessarily had that further factor in which it resembled Calvinism, the sense of predestination, the sense of fate, or what the followers of John Knox were always calling the immutable decrees of God. He goes on to suggest that there may even be some kind of demonic connection between the rise of Islam and the rise of Lutheranism. So he says, one of the reasons that the breakdown of Christendom at the Reformation took place was the fact that Mohammedan pressure against the German emperor gave the German princes and towns the opportunity to rebel and start Protestant churches in their dominions, which is probably historically the case. This would not be a Protestant faculty of divinity, but for the fact that the Ottomans made the Counter-Reformation and the wars launched by Catholic princes in Germany more or less impossible. It's true that both Luther and Calvin were anything but pro-Ottoman. In fact, they railed very passionately against the Turk. But for him, that does no more than disguise a real sibling rivalry, or even a kind of envy. In the end, all of these people, Reformed Christians and Turks and Saracens, they're all against the same things. They're against the fond superstition of the Mass, against images, against the ordained and celibate clergy, and against the Petrine principle without which there is no salvation. In contrast to the Orientalist consensus of his day, Belloc does not therefore see Islam as sui generis, as something categorically other and different. Muhammad is simply an Arab Calvin, and Medina is Geneva in a hot climate. But he claims that Islam's reformation is stronger, having succeeded permanently, while Protestantism is failing, and he points to the ongoing possibility of a great Islamic awakening. In Islam there has been no such dissolution of ancestral doctrine, or, at any rate, nothing corresponding to the universal break-up of religion in Europe. The whole spiritual strength of Islam is still present in the masses of Syria and Anatolia, of the East Asian mountains, of Arabia, Egypt and North Africa. The final fruit of this tenacity, the second period of Islamic power, may be delayed, but I doubt whether it can be permanently postponed. That culture happens to have fallen back in material applications. There is no reason whatever why it should not learn its new lesson and become our equal in all those temporal things which now alone give us our superiority over it, whereas in faith we have fallen inferior to it. And here we're really back with Chesterton. Ordinary non-conformity, a milksop affair, can never win England, but Islam, Protestantism's strongest strain, just might. Protestantism, as Weber thought, led to fragmentation and secularity, but the more successful and enduring Reformation, that of the Prophet, has been better than Christianity at resisting it. And in contrast to Hegel, who voiced the usual assumption that Islam's energy was spent, following which it has retreated into Oriental ease and repose, Belloc warned that the power of Islam may at any moment re-arise. And if you ever want a sufficient refutation of Hegel's view of history, just look at your headlines today and remember that Hegel said Islam is Oriental ease and repose. Belloc saw things much more clearly. The subsuming of Islam into the general category of Protestant heresy, as here attempted by Belloc and Chesterton, has not, of course, gone unchallenged. Traditionalists of the school of René Guénon will see Protestantism as a decadent fundamentalism, a superficiality, and contrast it absolutely with Islam, which for them is the very essence of authentic traditional religion. It might also be claimed that the Protestant Islamic equation represents a misprision of the centre of Islam as scripturalist and unmediated, upholding an older Orientalism and ignoring Louis Massignon's paradigm shift towards a Sufi authenticity in the Quran, which implies for him a Catholic contiguity with Islam as a religion of miracles, saints, relics, rosaries and scales of perfection. For Massignon and his not inconsiderable school, there is a real convergence between Catholic and Islamic spirituality. So who is right? At root, we might perhaps say that the contest is over Abraham. Derrida's well-known treatment of Massignon proceeds from the assumption that the category of Abrahamic religion is itself Islamic, which, although revived aberrantly by Kierkegaard in emphatically Protestant mode, is properly appropriated by Massignon, who constructs Abraham as a sign of sacramental origins and purpose. Derrida calls the Abrahamic a volcanic principle, which purports and indeed can supply hospitality, but which also is a figure of iconic difference and alienation. Abraham, as seen particularly in Gilles Anijar's meditations on Derrida's reception of Massignon, figures as the contested archetype for key oppositions: Europe and the Jews, Islam and the West, letter and spirit, Isaac and Ishmael. As Anijar writes, the Abrahamic confronts us as a divisive and repetitive machine and an explosive ghost that interrogates Hermetic histories and their dividing modes of operation. But Derrida has missed a further antinomy. Abraham is not only the Vorlage of the three-way schism of the Jewish, the Christian and the Islamic. Massignon's sacramental reading of the binding of Abraham's son makes the patriarch a contested theme for Protestant and Catholic belonging, and therefore using our link between the Reformation and Islam for Islam's engagement with the two main forms of Western Christianity. Abraham's sacrifice of the lamb, the anticipation of the Paschal mystery, is internalized in Islam's self-image as the Ishmaelite cast out but vindicated at the Hajj. Hence Azraqi's report that the horns of the ram were once hung from the drapes of the Kaaba. In his life of relationship with Muslims, Massignon stressed the vicarious and substitutionary, Hallaj as a Christ manqué, the Badaliya sodality, the Deuil de Fatima joint Marian pilgrimages. But this need not be taken as evidence of an inbuilt Roman instinct in Islam. In all this we find Massignon emphasizing Islam as an aspirant to Catholic fullness, as a proleptic, indeed the proleptic, Semitic faith, showing Arabs, and also Jews, the way to experience Christ through sacraments only dimly intuited in the Quranic data. Massignon's disciples, including those who joined Islam, like Vincent Montet, have generally not, I think, taken this proleptic theory further. His theology seems to have been stillborn. Montet, indeed, frankly retreated from it. So the idea of Islam as a providential sign to Semites, pointing to the fullness of the incarnation and of the Petrine succession, generally has lapsed, and you'd be very hard put, even in the fairly large industry of studies of Islam through Massignon and his legacy, you'd be hard put to find genuine adherents of that notion today. So I guess that Massignon's project might ultimately turn out to be a support rather than a challenge to Belloc's assumption that Islam was the first and the most successful Reformation. Just as Ishmael and Isaac are in the West story signs of a failed fraternity, so that Derrida's hope for a reconciling category of Arab Jew turns out to be without a resolution, so too Ishmael will always signify the non-sacramental, since Isaac was the one redeemed. Speculations about a first binding, which have Ishmael as the first sacrificial victim in his banishment to the desert and apparent certain death, are marginal, and in any case do not end with fida, with ransom. Isaac is undoubtedly the forerunning of the sacramental, Ishmael of the suffering servant who is to generate no priesthood. So the Abrahamic volcano produces this outcome. The internal schism in the Western Church produces non-sacramental, non-conformist, non-confessing sects whose etiology is more likely to conflate with Ishmael than the churches of the priests. Belloc and Chesterton would, I suspect, have agreed. How did this apparent congruity find expression at the time of the Reformation itself? The actual history of the role of Islam in the Reformation has yet to be adequately attempted beyond historiographies of the theme of the Turkish scourge, for instance, or the theme of the Inquisition as it seeks to uproot Protestant and Muslim cells in the Mediterranean Catholic lands. In Germany, Islam was a positive theme not in the Reformation literature but in the Enlightenment literature. You only have to look at Goethe's Mahomet's Gesang and Lessing's Nathan the Wise. As a non-mediative relation with God, it is implicit also in Rilke, who writes things like this: Muhammad was immediate, like a river bursting through a mountain range. He breaks through to the one God with whom you can talk so wonderfully every morning without the telephone called Christ, into which people constantly shout, "Hello, is anyone there?" and no one replies. In France, too, one finds a sympathy for the Prophet accompanying some dimensions of the Enlightenment. The Comte de Boulainvilliers, writing in 1728, so quite early, writes this: "There is no more plausible system than his, more agreeable to the light of reason." But his concerns really are those of the Lumière. It's the simplicity and the purity of the desert, not Ishmael specifically, that have allowed Islam to escape the superstitions of the Church. For such French admirers of Islam, institutions such as wudu, circumcision and the prohibition on pork are worthwhile because they're reasonable and hygienic, not because they denote a particular submission to God. But the English Reformation, here as on many other issues, was decidedly different. I've written other things on this, exploring what I take to be an enduringly Pelagian streak in the national religious style, reinforced in various ways by the rediscovery of Plato during the Reformation period and subsequently. Figures like Henry Stubb, who was personal physician to James I and author of the first ever appreciative biography of the Prophet written by a Christian, indicate a very real convergence which some of his contemporaries had noticed between Islam and a certain type of Puritanism. So he writes this: "This is the sum of Mahometan religion. On the one hand, not clogging men's faith with the necessity of believing a number of abstruse notions which they cannot comprehend, and which are often contrary to the dictates of reason and common sense, nor, on the other hand, loading them with the performance of many troublesome, expensive and superstitious ceremonies, yet enjoining a due observance of religious worship as the surest method to keep men in the bounds of their duty both to God and man." Sounds like a Puritan sermon, but he's actually praising the Prophet. Obviously, the history of reformist Christianity in this country is hugely complicated, and it's important to note that the established church represents a settlement substantially less Protestant than that which was normal on the continent. Sarah Mortimer has a new book, Reason and Religion in the English Revolution, in which she documents the rise of Socinianism, associated polemically with Islam, as the trigger for an Arminian reaction which led ultimately to the settlement of the 1650s, which to this day defines the relations between church and state in the United Kingdoms. In other words, on Mortimer's view, the so-called Mahometan controversies in England were an antithesis that fed only weakly into the final Anglican synthesis. The role of Unitarianism and crypto-Islamic currents at the time of the Civil War was only to goad the bishops into the definition of a reaction which was firmly Trinitarian and also quite strongly sacramental. British Christianity continued to claim apostolic continuity. While not in communion with Rome, it remained avowedly Catholic. Only in the last 20 years has the exodus of Anglo-Catholic priests, and we saw another bout of that just a couple of days ago, triggered by issues such as the admission of women to holy orders, reconfigured the power balance in the established church quite decisively in favour of the Protestant wing of the church. A few have claimed even this will to synthesis and mediation as indicative of at least an Islamic convergence. Most notably here has been the book by the former Bosnian president Alija Izetbegović. In his book Islam Between East and West, concludes with a eulogy to Anglicanism as a middle way. The debate over Izetbegovic's claim is likely to continue, but my point here is not really dependent on its outcome. I just want to signal the continued hospitality at the energetic margins of British religion in the early modern period, of forms of radical dissent which were descended organically from the Socinian Unitarian disputes which produced people like Henry Stubb. John Toland's Mahometan Christianity indicated, for instance, in his 1718 attempt to repristinate the Christian religion before the papal corruptions and usurpations. One might then make the following tentative claim for British Islam. It originates as a community in the temperance halls of Liverpool in the 1880s and 1890s. Quilliam's Mosque clearly replicated core dimensions of their form and function. And that matrix actually turns out to be an appropriate one, as Islam, seen as Protestant heresy, was a theme already of the English Reformation. And the Reformation itself was a kind of, in Belloc's language, second Islam, revisiting the ancient errors of the Arabian reformer and bringing them to the heart of Europe, where Berber and Turkish invasion had never reached. Chapel Christianity in particular would be seen from this perspective as a victory for the Islamic era. Hence the growth of Islam here is not so much the transplantation of a quintessentially foreign essence. Instead, from the viewpoint of Chesterton and Belloc, it can be seen as a belated incorporation into the country's religious life of a principle which is superficially exotic, but is already indigenous as one of the themes of the Reformation, and of some of the most characteristically English chapel-going forms of dissent. If the Protestant settlement in this country envisaged the existence of marginal groups, Quakers, Congregationalists, Baptists, Unitarians, Muggletonians and others, many of which may be seen as partaking in this convergence that we've noted between Islamic and Reformation principles, then British Muslims can potentially be seen as best incorporated in the nation's religious life by expanding the principle of the settlement. This may turn out to be more helpful than treating them in an ad hoc fashion as an originally immigrant community, which sometimes upsets the DCLG by seeking recognition in confessional rather than conventionally ethnic terms. Such a model does seem to have potential. On this view, mosques are not exotic temples to an unknown foreign god, but are Unitarian meeting houses of a particular kind, and we've known how to deal with them for at least 3 centuries. The parallel and the continuity, I want to stress again and again, will never be particularly exact. For instance, the model of community life in the dissenting sects is substantively different from the Islamic model of the Ummah. The Jama'ah, the mosque congregation, might seem, in its obedience to an elder or presbyter rather than a priest appointed by a bishop, to set Muslims well within the familiar Protestant order. However, the larger community is defined not as church, but as the ecumenical Ishmaelite world, the Ummah. One boundary marker of this, of course, is the purity laws, which are unknown to Protestantism. Of course, they are not, as with some forms of Old Testament religion, understood as defining solidarity and identity against a hostile other. Still, Islamic and Reformed notions of sociality will be considerably different. The Reformation proposed an often charismatic spirituality, but one linked to an individualism which, in its idea of the equality of every believer's reading of Scripture, sometimes seemed to reduce the spiritual value of human social ties. This is the alleged and widely admired Reformation root of modern individualism. In an Islamic context, where bodies are collectivized through purity laws and where a principle of ijma' controls scripture reading, the more vociferous tendencies of the Reformation moment are avoided. It's significant that it is in Shi'ism, a more hierarchical, mediatory form of religion, which in Islam has generated sects, while the Sunni, apparently Protestant mainstream, has usually managed to remain integrated. Now this talk has moved rather widely from a survey of the collapse of local Christianity to an assessment of the claim that Islam can meaningfully be seen as a kind of reformation. And my conclusion is probably already evident. Chesterton and Belloc, looking forwards 100 years ago, expected Britain to move in one of 3 general directions. Firstly, it might follow the Tractarian course into full communion with Rome, heralding a new era of faith when England would be rededicated to the Virgin. Secondly, it could mechanize until merry England was no more and the churches were turned to secular uses. Thirdly, it could continue with the Whiggish instincts of the nonconformist Reformation as revived in Wesleyan and other anti-alcoholic movements, a trajectory which Chesterton warns us is a kind of Mahometan Christianity. In this scheme, only Catholicism, the deep stratum of English religion, will allow us to be indigenous. The Church of Rome is the true Church of England. Anglicanism, following the rupture of the Henrician and Elizabethan Inquisitions, is a kind of alienation from the indigenous, although still, in its prayer book and vestments, nostalgic for the forms and habits of the old rituals. Chapel Christianity is the furthest point of this alienation from the English self. Now, almost 100 years on, we're likely to be impatient with this anachronism. To define medieval England, Mary's dowry, as the ultimate source of authenticity is arbitrary, and may open the way ultimately to the neo-pagan claim, currently gaining ground, that monotheism is itself inauthentic, a Middle Eastern intrusion into a Celtic Eden. As with all arguments for ultimate identity, this one essentializes a past which was always a time of transition and synthesis. What is most religiously authentic in Cambridgeshire, for instance? Rude screens and the Ambrosian chant? We're more likely to say Anglicanism and Methodist revivals of Handel's Messiah. As the Islamic conception of Isnad and Silsila makes clear, authenticity hinges on attachment to a tradition that is still alive. All else is a kind of abstract fundamentalism. We do not possess a culture. We share in a process which is forever in a state of becoming. Authenticity eludes us the moment we propose an essence. Muslimness has no single essence, neither has Britishness. British identity, like all social identities, has historically been constructed primarily in relation to a set of differences, not being French or Catholic or Republican, for instance, and these have all hugely shifted and in many cases vanished altogether. Take one example. The early 20th century novelist E.M. Delafield proposed an English creed in the following 4 articles. Firstly, God is an Englishman, probably educated at Eton. Secondly, all good women are naturally frigid. Thirdly, it is better to be dowdy than smart. Fourthly, England is going to rack and ruin. That's the checklist of what you have to believe in the deepest recesses of your English heart, truly to belong to the English species. And where is that checklist today? Compare it to the values espoused by the congregation in Alan Bennett's short story. On that argument, Britishness has not only been revised, it's been inverted. Islam, as a category used in the social sciences, may have a little more metaphysical substance, but it is still, as Clifford Geertz has shown, often operates as a historically conditioned kaleidoscope of perceptions and practices, united, no doubt, in the Sunni liturgical and doctrinal core, but variously interpreted by a non-magisterial consensus, particularly when in a minority condition. Part of that kaleidoscope, as I have suggested, can helpfully be seen as converging with the themes of the English Reformation. In that sense, once we abandon what is superficial, all British people wear duffel coats and like warm beer, all Muslims eat curry and support the Taliban, and recognise that certain deep structures of religious coherence lie beneath, it's not hard to see how we may set aside the old race relations paradigm of integration and recognise that an integration is already present. But it's not an integration based on David Cameron's liberal claims about shared values. In fact, secularity on our model may turn out not to ease integration but to obstruct it. For if Islam's appropriateness to the United Kingdom is to be sought mainly in the fact of a shared monotheism, then the diminution of the religious will make Islam's difference all the more salient. Thank you very much.